Hi, everybody. So now we're going to start our section on the reproductive system. And so in this video, I'll kind of give you a general overview of reproduction, but then we'll mainly focus on the male reproductive system. So we'll remind you a little bit of the anatomy, and then we'll look at spermatogenesis, or the cell division to create sperm. And then we'll also look at the hormonal control that's used in creating sperm as well. So this is the part, the hormonal control that I mentioned in the endocrine system, that we skipped a little bit over in the endocrine system because I knew we were going to do it here in the reproductive system. So as you can guess from what I just said, we're going to talk about hormones and the glands associated with the reproductive system. All righty, let's get started. Okay, so the reproductive system, I mean, really reproduction is the union. Let me actually go back a slide. It's the union of the male and female gametes. So the gametes is a general term for egg and sperm. So the female gametes are the eggs and the male gametes are the sperm. And so you can see in this real high powered microscope image, an egg here being fertilized by a sperm right now, just a single sperm. Later on, I'll show you it takes a lot more than one takes a lot of sperm in order to penetrate all the barriers to the egg, but only one sperm ultimately then fertilizes the egg, which is kind of what we see here. And the other picture, this is an actual National Geographic picture of bears mating. I just thought it was funny because you see her paw and her head there, like, whoo. You guys can put your own commentary on that. All right, so again, the reproductive systems are designed just to enable the union of the genetic material. And then you'll see in the female reproductive system, then it's designed also for the cell division. Once that's fertilization occurs, and then we have a single-celled organism called the zygote, then the cell division occurs to make the multicellular baby, the development inside of the uterus. So again, just some background. So the primary reproductive organs are, in males, it's the testes, and females, it's the ovaries, because these are the structures that are actually creating the egg and sperm. So the production of in general, the organs, the testes and the ovaries, those are referred to as the gonads. And again, in male, there's a pair of testes, and females, there's a pair of ovaries. And so the function when those organs are mature is to produce the gametes, the egg and the sperm, and that's through a process called gametogenesis. And we're going to refer to that in sperm. When you create sperm, it's called spermatogenesis. And in the creation of eggs, it's called oogenesis, because an egg is really called an ovum. Okay, and then in order for the gametogenesis to occur, hormones stimulate this action. And so the testes and the ovaries are also endocrine organs. So not only are they the site for the cell development, but they are also endocrine organs, making the respective hormones that are important in these processes. Okay. So the reproductive system, it can be kind of complex. And so when we refer to the reproductive tract, what we're referring to are the organs that are actually specialized ducts that transport the gametes or house the gametes after they're produced. Okay, and so we'll talk about the organs of the reproductive tract. And then there are accessory glands, sex glands, that provide the supportive secretions. So these are accessory glands. There are also glands associated along the reproductive tract, again, providing these supportive secretions. And then we may refer to external genitalia. So these are the externally visible portions of the reproductive system. So in males, it's much of the reproductive system is external. In females, most of the reproductive system is actually internal. Okay. And then secondary sexual characteristics. So these are the characteristics that aren't directly involved with reproduction. So they're not involved with the creation of the gametes or the transportation of them, but they're there to distinguish males and females. So this is what we're talking about: body configuration, muscle mass, that kind of thing, hair distribution. Okay, and so hormones, we'll see as we go through the lecture, the hormones actually support these secondary sexual characteristics as well. Okay, so the male reproductive system, if you've had anatomy already, these pictures should look familiar to you. Again, the main function of the male reproductive system is the production of sperm, and that occurs here in the testes. And again, there's a pair of testes, right? So on this side, you're just seeing a mid-sagittal section of the body, and we're seeing one testis. Okay, and then the other function then is to deliver the sperm to the female. So sperm are developed in the testes, then the rest of the organs, it'll move into the epididymis, which is an organ that sits on top of each testis. They'll mature inside of there, the sperm will mature and then get stored there until ejaculation. And at that point, there's a series of peristaltic contractions in the lining of the vas deferens or the ductus deferens. And here you see one here. And it goes up into the abdominal cavity, goes behind the urinary bladder. So this picture here is the back side, right? And as it goes, as the sperm travel through there, then they enter what's called the ejaculatory duct, and that takes them by the seminiferous, the seminal vesicle, what that produces secretions that support the sperm on their journey. Then the duct merges into the urethra inside of the prostate gland. That's this organ here, and you can see it here. So there's one prostate gland, well, there's a pair of seminal vesicles or seminal glands, right? But the prostate gland also produces its secretions to support the sperm as it travels through the prostatic urethra. Then it goes by two other little glands here. These are called bulbourethral glands, right? And there you can see one of them right there, known as the Cowper's gland, right? Producing secretions also to support the sperm. And then as they continue through the urethra, it goes through the penile urethra, and again, to be deposited into the female body. And that's another lecture. All righty. So we'll look at the functions of each of these organs as we go through. But we want to start at the testes. And because it's at the testes where we get the cell division occurring. So a little bit of general biology flashback. This is going to do with meiotic divisions, right? And also remember from general biology, we have two classes of cells, right? We have what are known as our body cells or somatic cells, and then we have germ cells, okay? And both of these types of cells are diploid. They have a diploid chromosome number. So again, it means you have two copies of the same gene, right? Or two copies of the chromosomes in each cell. And that's because you got one copy from mom and one copy from dad, right? And so body cells have that, and they retain the 46 chromosomes that humans have. And when we need to make more cells, like you wear away your cells, at the bottom there are stem cells that need to continuously make new cells to replace those. So they're just dividing by mitosis in order to maintain that diploid number of chromosomes, right? So within somatic cells, so those 46 chromosomes can be sorted into 23 homologous pairs. Again, so we have 23 distinct chromosomes, but they come in pairs because you got one copy from mom and you got one copy from dad, right? So the germ cells are the cells that are inside of the diploid cells that are inside of the testes and the ovaries. And so these are the cells that are going to divide to make the haploid gametes, or the haploid egg or sperm, as the case may be, right? So each haploid gamete has, let me try to move my picture. There we go. Each haploid gamete, the diploid germ cell divided by meiosis, and here you see the meiotic division of the germ cells. And the point then is to make in the female haploid eggs, or a haploid ovum, right? So taking her diploid number of chromosomes and dividing that in half, splitting those into half, that's the process of meiosis. And this, of course, this picture is skipping a lot of steps, which I'm going to show later. In the father, in the males, they also divide their germ cells by meiosis, creating the haploid sperm, right? So now each sperm has 23 chromosomes in there. Okay, and then the process of fertilization is when the sperm encounters an egg and is able to penetrate the egg, and its head, the head portion here, will go inside of the egg, because that's also the nucleus, and then will fuse with the nucleus of the ovum or the egg. And now you have a diploid zygote, right? This is a fertilized ovum. And then through mitosis, mitosis will occur to produce the multicellular embryo and later on fetus, creating all the organs and everything and producing the people that we are, right? So that's the general, the overall process of meiosis. Again, so remember though that, and once again, we'll go through this a little more specifically when I talk specifically about, there's your flashback, when I talk about spermatogenesis. But I also just wanted to remind you of the chromosomes. And so here are the human chromosomes. And again, we have 23 pairs, 22 of them, you see, they're all numbered up to 22. So 22 of them are what are called the autosomes, right? So these are the 22 pairs which code for the general human characteristics, and then specific traits like eye color or height or whatever it is. Okay, and so you can see the colors represent the different loci or the positions that specific genes fall on the chromosome, each chromosome pair. So again, one of these came from mom and the other one came from dad. Okay, so that's why we have 46 total, but 23 distinct. Now, again, the 22 are the autosomal chromosomes, which I just mentioned. The last pair, the 23rd pair, these are the sex chromosomes, and it's X and Y. So this karyotype, that's the distribution of chromosomes that we're seeing here, this karyotype is obviously for a man because it has the Y chromosome in there. If this were a woman, then there would not be a Y chromosome, it would be an X chromosome. All right, so again, when through the process of meiosis and through the process of gametogenesis, it uses meiosis to split these pairs in half. So remember from general bio, these are all lined up on the equator of the nucleus, and one chromosome from one pair will go to one cell, and the chromosome from another pair will go to the other cell. And that's what each one of these will do. So you'll end up with each one of these, just one of the copies in each of the new cells that divide, right? And so therefore, in men, they can make sperm that either have an X chromosome or they have a Y chromosome, okay? In eggs, in women can make eggs that each one will have an X chromosome in it, because women, again, are XX, so they only have the X chromosomes in order to release. Another thing to remember is that you can see the difference, how the large Y chromosome and the smaller X chromosome, I'm sorry, the large X chromosome and the smaller Y chromosome. I looked at those backwards as I was talking. The Y chromosome really only contains anywhere between 70 to 200 genes, and most of those genes are simply involved in sex determination and development. The Y chromosome has genes for other creating enzymes and other processes as well. So, and we're going to see when we look at spermatogenesis, we're going to see the consequence of cell division for those cells that don't have an X chromosome. It's really kind of interesting. Okay, so so again, see how the difference in size between the X and Y chromosome. So again, the Y chromosome makes the embryo male if it's present. What we'll see in a little bit is that during embryonic development, the tissues that begin to develop will default into the female tissues, form the female reproductive tract, unless the Y chromosome is present. If that Y chromosome is present and the genes turn on, and mainly it's called testes determining factor, which turns on codes for genes to turn on testosterone, then at that fetal stage, embryonic and fetal stage, the tissues that would have developed into the female organs will then develop, they will masculinize, we call that. They'll develop into the male organs. All right, oh, there it is. I put a little circle in there to show you the X and Y chromosome. All right, so this is basically what I was just saying. So again, in sex determination, the egg, of course, will contribute the X chromosome, but then the sperm can contribute either a Y chromosome or an X chromosome. So if the sperm that fertilizes the egg has an X chromosome in it, then the offspring will develop as female. If the sperm has a Y chromosome in it, then the offspring will develop as a male. And again, it's because that Y chromosome, one of the genes that it releases, that it has on there is an area of the Y chromosome called the sex determining region. And so those are a series of genes that code for, again, what I was just starting to mention before, testes determining factor, right? And so, so again, the embryo continued to develop the tissues into the female reproductive organs unless the testes determining factor is turned on and then the release of testosterone occurs. And I just found this picture. I thought it was interesting. This is the human sex determining region of the DNA. You can see the green. This is the DNA, the helix, and this is the actual region where that is. I don't know. Molecular structures are kind of cool to look at. All righty. And then when the fetus is developing inside of the womb and it's going to be a male, like I said, and your textbook goes into more depth of the embryonic development of males. And so I'm not going to hold you responsible for that on the test, but it's interesting. So if you'd like to read through it, you can do that. And so it just kind of shows how the tissues will, again, default to female, or with the presence of testosterone, will start to develop the male structures such as the testes and also what's called the gubernaculum testes. And so in the fetus, when the male fetus is developing inside of the womb, the testes develop way up here, kind of the location of the kidneys. Right? They're not showing any of the other organs, but that's about the level where these testes are. And then the gubernaculum testes it's like a cord that as the fetus develops, and this is fetal development at 2 months, 3 months, right? It starts to draw downward, right? And it draws downward, and as it draws downward, then it will leave through a space in the abdominal cavity here. It'll push through that space and exit the abdominal cavity. And then as it does, you can see then that it creates a cord that's going to then later develop into the vas deferens, will travel through here, and also blood supply and nerves. But with the skin, with it, and layers of the skin, which will develop the scrotum. And you should have learned those layers of the skin, and there's smooth muscle layer in there to develop the scrotum as well. You should have learned that in anatomy. So we're not going to go over that specifically in physiology, right? And so again, what what I want to get at then is the function of the testes. Their function then is to produce sperm. And we're going to look inside of the testes in just a minute and see coils and coils and coils of tubes in there where the sperm develop. Okay, and then they're also to produce testosterone. And so this is the main organ in males that will produce testosterone. And there are types of cells in there called Leydig cells. They're also known as interstitial cells. And those are the actual cells produce testosterone. So you got a little glimpse already from the endocrine system that it's all going to be first controlled by the hypothalamus and then the anterior pituitary, and hormones are going to target the testes to stimulate the testes to release testosterone. Okay, but that's going to be at a specific time period. All righty. So here's what's interesting is you can see it's just before birth that the testes really descend fully outside of the body. And so, but sometimes it doesn't always do it in time. They don't always descend before birth. And so this is where a lot of times then, you know, dads are in the birthing room with mom and she's given birth, and then their male baby comes out, they see the penis, but there are no testes, and they freak out. Dads usually freak out over that, but you know, hold on, dads, just calm down. It'll give it a few days to a week or so, and the testes will come out. It'll be okay. All right. All right, so here we are inside of mature male testes, right, in the male reproductive system. So if we did a cross section and you looked inside of there, you'll see these coils of seminiferous tubules, right? There are about 800 tubules inside of each testes, and each one is about 80 centimeters in length. So if you do the math with 800 tubules at that long, then each testis contains about half a mile of seminiferous tubules. That's how many tubules are coiled up inside of that organ. And so if we looked inside of the tubule, running the length of the tubules along all that 80 centimeters of each of those 800 seminiferous tubules are lines of cells. So again, you're just looking at one row. So you got to imagine the cells are continuing down this length. Okay, and so these are the germ cells that are dividing to produce, eventually will divide by meiosis to produce the sperm in the middle. So at each meiotic division, they're pushing the new cells toward the lumen or to the center of the seminiferous tubule, where eventually the end of the meiotic division is where the sperm are produced. And so they're inside of there. And then we'll see that there'll be, there's fluid inside of there, and that current will kind of move the sperm, the tubules out toward the epididymis. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, but you can see inside of the testes and the epididymis, it's mainly just a series of tubes. And this is where the sperm develop and then travel through. Okay, in between the tubes, so here you see one full tube, kind of the cross section of it. Here's another one, here's another one. So in between these tubes are the interstitial cells, or what are called the Leydig cells. So these are the cells that produce testosterone. And we'll see a little bit later that the testosterone is what stimulates the spermatogenesis, or the creation of the sperm. Okay, within the tubule, there's types of cells called Sertoli cells. They're also called sustentacular cells. So it depends on what physiology book you're reading. They might call them one or the other. So notice I put different abbreviations here. So you just make sure you understand these abbreviations so when you see them in later slides. Sertoli cells of the STs, meaning the seminiferous tubules, right? So they actually contain receptors for the follicle stimulating hormone. So remember that will be released from the anterior pituitary gland. And that stimulates spermatogenesis, along with LH coming from the anterior pituitary gland. That stimulates those Leydig cells to release testosterone, which also stimulates spermatogenesis. So there's a permissive effect going on here, or a synergistic effect going on here. Wow. That almost didn't come to me. Okay, and so if right now, if you're going, wait a minute, what hormone does what? Don't worry, we'll put it all together at the end. At this point, it's more about just kind of understanding the anatomy of where the cells are and then their functions, what they produce. We're going to put it all together in sequence a little bit later. All right. Okay, so here also is just some more microscopic views of the seminiferous tubules and what those look like. So here's more of them. The previous slide, really, you can only see one. Here's an actual microscope slide. So there's a seminiferous tubule, one there, right, all cut in these cross sections. So that means in between them, these are the Leydig cells or interstitial cells, right? So those are the testosterone producing cells in between. But it's within the seminiferous tubules that we find those Sertoli cells. And that's what this cell is. And the Sertoli cells are kind of these really big cells that where they kind of surround the germ cells and the spermatids, the cells that are going through meiosis to produce the sperm. So you can see, so again, all of this orange structure here, you can see all the organelles and things inside. That is one Sertoli cell, and it's the spermatogonium, which is the diploid cell, which will then divide eventually by meiosis to produce the spermatids. And they push through that cell, so the Sertoli cell just kind of protects it. It's a nice protection of it, right? And again, the Leydig cells then are outside of this. They're actually outside of the tubule. So there's a lot of protection of the sperm because they're very, very sensitive. They're very small cells. And there's a blood testis barrier. And so the Sertoli cell helps to maintain the blood testis barrier. So the capillaries would be outside of the seminiferous tubules, right? And we don't want just any hormone and any toxins to get in at the sperm. So the blood testis barrier helps with that. And that's partly what these Sertoli cells do. All right. So one of the things I just wanted to mention, because we keep talking about testosterone. Testosterone is a very important hormone in males. Again, it's a steroid hormone. It's actually derived from cholesterol. So that makes it lipid soluble. And there's actually, it does a lot. It has 5 categories of effects. And so it also depends on when it's released. So again, during fetal development, there'll be a burst, that sex determining region of the genes will turn on, and there'll be a burst of testosterone. And again, what that does is to masculinize the tissues that are developing so that they develop into the external genitalia of males, right? And then also promotes the descent of the testes into the scrotum, right? And then after birth, there's usually a long period of what's the word I want? Hibernation of testosterone. That's not the word I want, but you get what I mean. Just kind of a real low amount of testosterone from about birth until puberty. And then once puberty hits, testosterone will be released again. And again, that's going to just promote growth. It's going to promote maturation of the reproductive system, and then other reproductive related effects. The sex drive will increase. It controls gonadotropin hormone secretion. We're going to see a feedback loop there. And it also stimulates the secondary sexual characteristics, right? So there's the male pattern of hair growth, in the pubic regions and the axillary region, the beard, chest, so just the typical of males. Tissues around the vocal cords will begin to thicken, and that causes the deeper voice, and then muscle growth that just kind of gives the overall male body condition. Right. And then there's other effects. It helps to build protein, building bone at puberty, closing the epiphyseal plates as kids get older, and then also is associated with a little bit more aggressive behavior as well. Okay. Okay, so let's get into spermatogenesis, because that's the part we want to get into with physiology. So again, the creation of the sperm inside of the seminiferous tubules, it starts with a spermatogonium. Okay, so this is what's undifferentiated diploid germ cells. Okay, they're called spermatogonia, and they're mainly made, produced during, actually, they're produced during puberty. And so what happens is in spermatogonium, there'll be a burst of cell division by mitosis. Okay, and so all that does is to proliferate the germ cells so that there are many, many more. So the germ-forming daughter cell keeps dividing by mitosis, and you can see until you finally produce what are called the primary spermatocyte. And so this is still diploid, but these are going to be the cells that enter meiosis, right, in order to reduce the number of chromosomes by half. Okay, so again, so each primary spermatocyte, once it gets the signals from the hormones, which we'll layer on later, that starts the first meiotic division. Okay, and so the first meiotic division, recall from general biology, means that we take the diploid cell and we've divided into two, and that's where we divide the chromosomes into each cell. So each of the, now what are called the secondary spermatocytes, are haploid in number. But then each one of those can go through their second meiotic division, and each one of those can produce two. And so and again, we maintain the haploid number at the second meiotic division. Right? And so now these are called spermatids because they don't have the characteristics of a sperm yet. Okay, and so a sperm, its function is to be able to swim to encounter an egg and then wear down the coating that surrounds an egg, a protective coating. They've got to wear it down so that they can then penetrate the cell membrane and get inside of the cell. So we'll see that the structure of the sperm needs to develop from these cells in order to A, get a tail to allow it to swim, and then B, form a little cap on top of the head region where is filled with enzymes in order to penetrate those protective coatings of the egg. Okay, so this pre-packaging, you can think of it that way, reorganizing the cell to look like this is called spermiogenesis. So different from spermatogenesis. Okay, so spermatogenesis, again, is the cell division. Okay, going from diploid primary spermatocytes into haploid spermatids. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. So remember that when the diploid cells divide, right here, diploid cells divide, this is a primary spermatocyte, so it's diploid. This cell has one X chromosome and one Y chromosome in it because it comes from the males, right? So that means when this cell divides, one cell gets the X chromosome, one cell gets the Y chromosome. And that's the same in each one of these, okay? Notice at this stage, at the secondary spermatocyte, and even at the spermatids, the cells are connected to one another. You never really saw that in general biology when you were studying meiosis, right? We always drew them so these cells were all completely separate from one another. Well, in sperm, they stay connected, and it's because of what I told you about the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome doesn't contain the genes in order to keep the cell proliferating. It needs genes that are located on the X chromosome to produce enzymes and things that'll allow these spermatids to continue to mature, right? So they evolved to stay connected to one another after the meiotic divisions, right? So they stay connected because if this cell has the X chromosome, whatever materials that X chromosome can produce will leak into the adjacent cell, keeping the cell viable, right? So therefore, thank the X chromosomes. The X chromosomes keep you going so that we can have males in the population. I just think that's kind of a cool little feature, how that developed in order to keeping the cells that contain Y chromosomes viable. All right, so again, so now we're at the end of the meiotic division, but we need to repackage the sperm. And so that happens in a process called spermiogenesis. So I mentioned it before, but I'm going to say it again. Spermiogenesis is already, you've got haploid cells, but you need to package them to look like sperm, right, to get the function of sperm. Spermatogenesis, okay, is the spermatogenesis, AT, is the process of dividing diploid cells into haploid cells, okay, specifically for sperm. All righty. So when the sperm develop, they actually remain really closely associated with those Sertoli cells that I told you about inside of the seminiferous tubules. And so the spermiogenesis, again, what they're doing is the circular cell will actually modify, and so the nucleus gets retained. And so most of the head of the sperm is the nucleus, and then it develops what's called an acrosome. This is an enzyme-filled vesicle located at the top, and it's got, those enzymes are used again to wear down the protective coating of the egg. And we'll see more of that when we do the female reproductive system. Okay, so that is used to penetrate inside the ovum. Well, before that can happen, it needs to swim to the egg, and it also uses its tail to kind of push the head of the sperm into the cell membrane of the egg. So in order to do that, it needs a tail. This is a flagellum. So the humans don't have any flagella in their cells except for the sperm. So only males really have a flagellum. So if you remember learning about flagella back in general bio. All right, so that flagellum needs to move. So the mid piece, or sometimes called the neck, that's where there's mitochondria, that their sole purpose is to create ATP to move the tail. Okay, so the only part that it gets contributed to the offspring that will develop is the nucleus, right? The DNA. The rest of the structure of the sperm is simply to get the sperm to the egg and to help it fertilize it. It doesn't contribute to any of the parts of the offspring. Whereas the machinery inside the egg, that actually is contributed to the offspring, okay? But pretty important job there. I said just, but that's an important job, right? So again, a lot's going on with our Sertoli cells. All right, so I thought I'd just kind of summarize them here. I mentioned it forms that blood testis barrier, right? They also help provide nourishment. You saw that big cell, a lot of cytoplasm in there, so that can contain the sugars and other things needed to nourish the spermatids as they're developing, right? They have a phagocytic function. So if some of those spermatids don't develop properly, they can actually phagocytize them and clean them out, get rid of them. Right? They secrete the fluid that develops inside of the seminiferous tubule. So remember, I mentioned that the sperm have to travel through that tubule to get to the next organ, the epididymis. So it does that through a fluid. And again, so the fluid comes from the Sertoli cells, and that flushes the sperm from those tubules, again, into the epididymis for additional processing. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the Sertoli cells also secrete what's called ABP, androgen binding protein, into the lumen of the seminiferous tubules. And what it does is it binds to the hormone testosterone, allowing testosterone to concentrate inside of those tubules. And so again, remember I mentioned testosterone helps to stimulate spermatogenesis, right? And then FSH, I don't remember if I have more. Yeah, I do. FSH also stimulates spermiogenesis through receptors on the Sertoli cells, and they help provide negative feedback to slow down the release of FSH from the anterior pituitary. And Sertolis do that by releasing a hormone called inhibin. So inhibin causes the negative feedback. Again, we're going to put all this together at the end, showing you a flow chart with how all the hormonal control. Oh, there it is. I guess we're almost at the end. We're not quite at the end, but we're almost at the end, right? So here we are. So this is what you saw in the endocrine system. We're up at the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus cells secrete gonadotropins releasing hormone that travels through the infundibulum, through the portal, capillary portal system, to the anterior pituitary, causing those specific cells receptive to GnRH to release luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone target different cells, right? So luteinizing hormone targets the Leydig cells. So I remember L for luteinizing and L for Leydig, right? And that's going to cause the Leydig cells to secrete testosterone. And testosterone is going to help with spermatogenesis, right? And we'll get to the negative feedback in a minute, right? It also causes those other masculinizing effects we talked about. But let's go with FSH now. FSH targets the Sertoli cell, right? And that also helps stimulate spermatogenesis, okay? And so with testosterone and the Sertoli cells stimulating spermatogenesis, now sperm are developing inside of the seminiferous tubules. So once that's been spurred to start, we want to slow down this process. We don't need all those hormones again. So the rise of testosterone in the bloodstream will cause a negative feedback back on the hypothalamus. So it reduces its secretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone, but it also provides a negative feedback on the cells of the anterior pituitary that release luteinizing hormones. So it's a selective inhibition. So that slows down the release of luteinizing hormone, right? Slowing down the spermatogenesis. At the same time, those Sertoli cells, once they're stimulated by FSH, they start to release inhibin. So inhibin is that hormone that only acts on the anterior pituitary gland, and also only on the cells that produce FSH. So it slows all of that down. So again, the idea is once you've stimulated all of those cells to start producing sperm, we can slow it down. We want those sperm now to, those cells, those primary cells to become secondary cells and so on, and complete the process before we start this stimulation again. So there seems to be a cycle with men, but it hasn't really been pinpointed. It's not as blatant as it is in the female reproductive system, where we have definite cycles, which we'll talk about in the next video. Okay, and so I mentioned before, again, all the spermatogenesis occurring along a half a mile of tubules in each testis. A human male can produce 500 million sperm a day. That's the capacity with all of this. Alrighty. Okay, so sperm developed in the seminiferous tubule. They're ready to move out. They move out from the fluids. They move through the retrotestis, which is a series of tubules connecting each of the seminiferous tubules, and connects it to the tubes of the epididymis. So this structure on top here is the epididymis. And so you don't have to go through all the tubules in physiology as you did in anatomy, but just realize then that the sperm, as they're passing through the efferent ductules and get to the epididymis tubes, this is then where the sperm are stored and they're concentrated in this area. Okay, so over time, more and more sperm will be concentrated in this area. Okay, actually, I realize I have another slide that shows you all of that. There you go. So in the epididymis, sperm are stored and they're concentrated. And then also within here, there can be some looking over the sperm to increase their motility and also cleaning out any deformed sperm. So we saw some of that in the seminiferous tubule with the Sertoli cells, but also is to kind of pick out any of the sperm that don't have good motility or fertility, and so it can break them down and reabsorb those. Okay, then they get stored kind of in the lower portion of the epididymis and the lower portion of the vas deferens or the ductus deferens. Again, this is happening in both. Okay, and then it isn't until a sexual act that stimulates the release of the sperm, and that's going to cause, that's the function of ejaculation. So the ductus deferens have layers of smooth muscle, and through peristaltic waves of contraction, it pushes the sperm up through the ductus deferens on both sides. And like I mentioned before, then it travels past each of these glands. So here you see the pair of seminiferous seminal vesicles, right? And they're going to produce about 60% of the fluid that the sperm end up traveling in. So the sperm and the fluid together is referred to as semen. So in the seminal vesicles, again, it's producing about 60% of the semen. And basically it's supplying the semen with fructose. And that's what the sperm, the mitochondria, are going to use for energy to move the tail. So they're going to use that to break it down. Fructose is very similar to glucose. So it can use that to break it down to allow the tail to move. So right now they're not mobile, but it's the ejaculation that helps, that's mobilizing the sperm right now, right? And so let's see what else. I'm trying to give you the highlights. Well, the other thing is the seminal vesicles supply a series of chemicals called prostaglandins, and prostaglandins have a lot of jobs in the body, and I think I have a slide coming up next regarding that. But one of the things that prostaglandins do in reference to the male reproductive system is it what provides that smooth muscle motility in the vas deferens to get it moving, right? And also in the female reproductive tract, the prostaglandins can also stimulate in the female reproductive tract smooth muscle movement, and that enhances the sperm transport. Right. So again, then it's got to go through, so it comes out the ejaculatory duct by each of the seminal glands into the prostate gland, and this is the prostatic urethra. So the prostate gland surrounds the urethra, and this contributes an alkaline fluid that neutralizes the acidic vaginal secretions. So the vaginal secretions are actually a little too acidic for sperm. So the fluids coming from the prostate gland contributing to the semen then helps to neutralize that. And then it also provides clotting enzymes and to allow the sperm, the semen to kind of clot up. And that again allows the sperm a little bit better environment to travel in. And then it goes by a pair of bulbal urethral glands, again, also called Cowper's glands. And this releases a lubricating mucus that can lubricate the penis and the ends of the penis as well. Okay. And so then it's on a journey. Again, here's the action of the prostaglandins. This table's in your book. And what I boxed out here, this is the role, what I've been talking about here in promoting sperm transport. You can see, though, prostaglandins are really important in our bodies for a lot of different functions. You don't need to remember all of these now. Just know its function here in this box, how it helps promote the transport of sperm. Okay. All right. So when does all this start? It starts at the onset of puberty. And so why does puberty get going? Well, before puberty starts, there's actually really high secretion of FSH and LH for the first 6 months of life. And so again, that's going to help stimulate testosterone and things, and that's just going to help the baby develop into the male again. And so there's a high amount of testosterone before birth, and then it continues in the first 6 months of life, again, still helping to masculinize the tissues. But then it falls really low until puberty. Right? at puberty, they think puberty gets stimulated by an increased secretion of LH, but it's kind of like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, because the hypothalamus has to increase the gonadotropin releasing hormone secretion, which then in turns continues to secrete, increase the secretion of LH and FSH, right? So again, that's going to stimulate the sex steroid secretion. And so that's going to stimulate then the spermatogenesis and spermiogenesis, but then again also drives those secondary sexual characteristics. It's also, testosterone is important in girls as well, but here I'm mentioning the sex steroid secretion. So this slide overlaps a little bit with females as well. So it can also stimulate the estrogen and progesterone, which stimulates the first menstrual flow, which is referred to as menarche, right? And then again, the growth of pubic hair and axillary hair usually due from the androgen secretion from the adrenal cortex. Okay, so this is puberty for both males and females. You can see that purple line is male, the yellow line is females, and females tend to reach puberty a couple of years before males do, right? And so when females hit puberty, there's a high amount of estrogen that gets released, and that helps to stimulate growth. In boys, when there's a high amount of testosterone that gets released, then they get a growth spurt. You can see on the y-axis, this is also height, right? So they get a growth spurt. So that's why girls mature faster than boys, right? They hit maturity first, or puberty first. They also tend to grow faster. That's why most of us in like 5th, 6th, 7th grade, we're all taller than the boys. And then all of a sudden over summer vacation before 8th grade, the boys hit this growth spurt. And when we come back at 8th grade, they're all taller than us. And then we're all scared going, oh man, I was kind of mean to that boy when he was shorter than me last year. Now he's taller than me. And hopefully he forgets. Of course he forgets, because the girls are developing into girls and they're interested in girls now, right? I don't know, I just had to throw that in there. All righty, but again, you can see the differences, and it's because of the timing of the release of estrogen in females and testosterone in males. The age of puberty in girls, though, seems to be tied a lot to the percentage of body fat and physical activity. So many times girls with low body fat, and usually that's maybe they're very athletic, they may then actually hit puberty a little bit later. They won't have their first period until a little bit later, whereas, you know, maybe 13, 14, 15 years old even sometimes. What we are seeing now, though, which is kind of a crisis in this country, is our children are getting more and more obese. They're suffering from obesity, and it's probably mostly because of the high fructose corn syrup and the bad foods that we have that are really cheap to get. It's much easier to get cheap food than it is to get high quality food, which is a crisis in this country, I think. And one of the problems with that is, again, obesity in our children. And that affects girls because they can actually, it could stimulate their first period much earlier in life, 8 or 9 years old, 9, 10, where usually it should be about 12 years old or so. And that could have problems later in life. It seems to be the earlier the onset of puberty in girls, later in life it's associated with more cancers and things like that. So the jury's still a little bit out on that, but it's something that we really need to consider, and why we need to maintain the health and weight in all aspects of both our boys and girls as they're growing up. Right. And then I wanted to throw some things in here about male fertility. So the normal volume of ejaculate is about 2 to 6 milliliters. And within there, that means there's about 60 to 150 million sperm per milliliter. you need at least 60 million sperm per milliliter for fertility. Anything lower than that, and especially a low sperm count of less than 20 million, constitutes a term we call oligospermia. So that's low sperm count. And I'll show you some pictures in a minute. Again, it takes, although only one sperm can fertilize the egg, it takes many sperm to start wearing down the protective coating around the egg, so just that one sperm can get in, right? So the number of sperm is really important from that point of view. Things that can cause low sperm count, heat, different types of poisoning like lead or arsenic poisoning, drugs, including marijuana, cocaine, steroids, all of these things can cause a lower sperm count. And worldwide, they've been noticing in the last 20 years, male fertility is declining. And so researchers are trying to figure out why that is. Here's another reason for male infertility. Again, the sperm may be deformed, and especially if the tail is deformed and it can't move, it won't be able to get to the egg, right? Here's male contraception. There's a couple different there's been some attempts at trying to do like an oral contraception because the cycle of hormones is much more simple in males than it is females. But there really hasn't been anything developed that really works yet. There's something called gossipal. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right. Gossipal. That comes from the plant, the cotton plant, and it actually interferes with sperm development. And so I believe, I just looked it up because this was kind of old, and I looked it up on WebMD, and it looks like this can still be prescribed. However, that you have to be careful with it, because in about 20% of men that use this, they develop permanent infertility. So they usually don't prescribe this except to men who might be older, maybe they're done having their families. So it isn't that common right now. The more common male contraception is vasectomy. And vasectomy is, I put a picture here, there's actually something called no scalpel vasectomy, because they've developed these teeny tiny little tools that can make a little incision inside of the skin, and they into the spermatic cord, and they can pull the vas deferens and just cut that, and then they tie off each end, and when each end is tied off, sperm have nowhere to go. So the testes can still produce sperm, but they don't get released during ejaculation. Now, the ejaculate still contains semen, it just doesn't have the sperm, because all the other glands, the seminal glands, prostate gland, the bulbourethral glands, they're still functional. So semen is still produced, right? But the sperm end up staying inside of the epididymis, and then eventually they get phagocytized by the immune system. And then about 70% of men actually develop an anti-sperm antibodies. And so this function of developing sperm actually gets less and less over time as well. So it's a vasectomy, very simple procedure. I don't even think there are any stitches on the outside here. It's just cutting the ends of the vasectomy, of the vas deferens. All right, I thought I had a picture of, I have that in the female reproductive system. So I'll show you the picture of all the sperm needed to fertilize an egg. But that's it for male reproduction. Thank you guys for listening.